Could you explain what is the difference between dispensationalism and covenant theology? Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, those terms are kind of confusing
Hmm.
because covenant theology, that kind of sounds like dispensationalism because we're the ones in dispensationalism that emphasize the covenants. But anyway, the best of my understanding is the starting point of the two systems is different.
Hmm.
Charles Ryrie developed what's called the sine qua non of dispensationalism, which is a Latin expression meaning without which there is not. In other words, if you took away one of these three elements,
Hmm.
you wouldn't have dispensationalism. And his first element is the consistent, which is a very important word,
Hmm.
consistent application of the literal, grammatical, historical, contextual method of interpretation. And we believe that once you apply that from Genesis to Revelation, you'll see in the biblical text the fact that God has two separate programs,
Hmm.
one for national Israel and one for the church.
Hmm.
And Israel's program is basically uh, developed through the biblical covenants. So we believe there's a foundational Abrahamic covenant.
Hmm.
Later on in Scripture, there's a land covenant, then there's a Davidic covenant, then there's a new covenant. And we get that because of the Hebrew word berith.
Hmm.
We don't just read covenants into the Bible, but each of these covenants, as you read them, they clearly demonstrate that God has commitments to Israel that he hasn't fulfilled yet.
Hmm.
And so that's, to the best of my knowledge, dispensationalism. Covenant theology, sometimes called Reformed theology, comes from a different angle entirely. It starts with something they call a covenant of grace.
Hmm.
And their own guys will tell you, I've got a couple quotes from them,
Hmm.
like in Charles Hodge and other places, that covenant is not expressly mentioned in Scripture like our covenants are.
Right.
So it's sort of something that is superimposed from the top down. Dispensationalism is starting from the bottom up.
Mm.
And because they're trying to find this, they're actually reading the Bible through a presuppositional a priori lens called the covenant of grace.
Hmm.
They end up taking some parts of the Bible literally and some parts not literally.
Hmm.
They don't take the 1,000 years in Revelation 20 literally. They'll tell you that the Abrahamic covenant is heaven, rather than literal land, and so they sort of end up soteriologizing
Hmm.
some parts of the biblical text where dispensationalism is not doing that. And so I would call it more of a top to bottom approach, where they're reading the Bible through a lens, through a theological covenant that they've basically, for lack of better expression, basically made up.
Hmm.
And so those two systems are teaching two different things because their starting point is different. Dispensationalism is trying to build its theology from the text, and covenant theology, the best I can tell, has already developed its theology and
Hmm.
is approaching the biblical test through that text, rather, through that theological system. So, where you end up in anything depends on where your starting point. And so the starting points of the two systems, the best I can tell, are totally different.